Hello, we are happy to be back. Please subscribe and click on the bell. It is very important for us. And please support us on Patreon. Link is down below. Today we're talking about one of the most mentioned and discussed paper of the last 35 years, The End of History by Francis Fukuyama. This article was printed in the journal The National Interest in 1989. Fukuyama begins by contemplating about the end of the Cold War and the fact that in the late 80s, peace seemed to be breaking out in many regions of the world. It was definitely a breakthrough because the 20th century saw the developed world go through ideological violence as remnants of absolutism, liberalism, Marxism, and fascism fought each other. Thus, the end of the century was marked by the triumph of the Western liberal democracy, both economically and politically. The evidence of that is the total exhaustion of viable systematic alternatives to liberalism, as communist bloc faced serious predicaments. One of the key points of the article is what we may be witnessing is not just the end of the Cold War or the passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such. That is the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. However, the notion of the end of history is not the original one. It was already used by Karl Marx, who believed that the direction of historical development was a purposeful one, determined by the interplay of material forces that would come to an end only with the achievement of a communist utopia that would finally resolve all prior contradictions. But the concept of history as a dialectical process with a beginning, a middle, and an end was borrowed by Marx from German philosopher Georg Hegel. Hegel proclaimed history to be at an end in 1806. For as early as this, Hegel saw the Napoleon's defeat of the Prussian monarchy in the Battle of Jena, the victory of the ideals of the French Revolution, and the imminent universalization of the state, incorporating the principles of liberty and equality. While there was considerable work to be done after 1806, abolishing slavery and the slave trade, extending the franchise to workers, women, racial minorities, etc., the basic principles of the liberal democratic state could not be improved upon. The two world wars in the 20th century and their attendant revolutions and upheavals simply had the effect of extending those principles spatially, such that the various provinces of human civilization were brought up to the level of its most advanced outposts. The state that emerges at the end of history is liberal insofar as it recognizes and protects through a system of law man's universal right to freedom, and democratic insofar as it exists only with the consent of the governed. For human history and the conflict that characterized it was based on the existence of contradictions, primitive man's quest for mutual recognition, the dialectic of the master and slave, the transformation and mastery of nature, the struggle for the universal recognition of rights, and the dichotomy between proletarian and capitalist. But in the universal, homogeneous state, all prior contradictions are resolved and all human needs are satisfied. There is no struggle or conflict over large issues. For Hegel, the contradictions that drive history exist first of all in the realm of human consciousness, meaning on the level of ideas. Ideas in the sense of large unifying worldviews that might best be understood under the rubric of ideology. Ideology in this sense is not restricted to the secular and explicit political doctrines, but can also include religion, culture, and the complex of moral values underlying any society as well. Fukuyama poses the question, have the world in fact reached the end of history? In other words, are there any fundamental contradictions in human life that cannot be resolved in the context of modern liberalism, that would be resolvable by any alternative political economic structure? Fukuyama then provides a historical retrospective of the ideological battles between liberalism and the other ideologies. World War I put an end to the remnants of absolutism. The empires were destroyed. Fascism was destroyed as a living ideology by World War II. This was a defeat, of course, on a very material level, but it amounted to a defeat of the idea as well. The ideological challenge mounted by the other great alternative to liberalism, communism, was far more serious. Marx, speaking Hegel's language, asserted that liberal society contained a fundamental contradiction that could not be resolved within its context, that between capital and labor. And this contradiction has constituted the chief accusation against liberalism ever since. One may argue that the socialist alternative was never terribly plausible for the North Atlantic world, but it's precisely in the non-European world in the 1980s that one was most struck by the occurrence of major ideological transformation. Big changes have occurred in Asia. Liberalism in Asia was very weak in the period after World War I. The economic success of the newly industrializing countries in Asia, following on the example of Japan, is well known. Political liberalism has been following economic liberalism. Fukuyama provides the example of South Korea that had developed into a modern, urbanized society with an increasingly large and well-educated middle class. But the most significant change was in China. The Chinese Communist Party decollectivized agriculture for the 800 million Chinese who still lived in the countryside. The role of state in agriculture was reduced to that of a tax collector, while production of consumer goods was sharply increased. Summarizing the Marxist-Leninist alternative, Fukuyama cites the reforms in the Soviet Union as an indicator of the crisis of this ideological concept. He mentions migrants from the Soviet Union who have been reporting for a long time that nobody in the country truly believed in Marxism-Leninism any longer. But the system was capable of functioning adequately out of inertia. However, since Gorbachev's coming to power, that has changed. Inefficiency of central planning, introduction of free market, enterprise autonomy, creation of cooperatives, lease agreements, and family farming. All this has significantly changed life in the USSR. Fukuyama stresses that the end of history is not necessarily that all societies become successful liberal democracies, just that they end their ideological pretensions of representing different and higher forms of human society. After that, he goes on to the question: if communism is in retreat, what are other challenges? He suggests two possibilities: religion and nationalism. The rise of religious fundamentalism has been widely noted in the late 80s. One is inclined to say that the revival of religion in some way attests to a broad unhappiness with the impersonality and spiritual emptiness of liberal consumerist societies. However, modern liberalism itself was historically a consequence of the weakness of religiously based societies, which, failing to agree on the nature of the good life, could not provide the minimal preconditions of peace and stability. The other major contradiction, potentially unresolvable by liberalism, the one posed by nationalism and other forms of racial and ethnic consciousness. It is certainly true that a very large degree of conflict since the Battle of Jena has had its roots in nationalism. Two cataclysmic world wars in the 20th century have been spawned by the nationalism of the developed world, and if those passions have been muted for a certain extent in Europe, they are still extremely powerful in the Third World. But it is not clear that nationalism represents an irreconcilable contradiction in the heart of liberalism. The vast majority of the world's nationalist movements do not offer anything like a comprehensive agenda for socio-economic organization. Fukuyama concludes that the fundamental principles of socio-political organization have not advanced far since 1806. Many of the wars and revolutions fought since that time have been undertaken in the name of ideologies which claimed to be more advanced than liberalism, but those pretensions were ultimately unmasked by history. In the meantime, they have helped to spread the universal homogeneous state to the point where it could have a significant effect on the overall character of international relations. What are the implications of the end of history for international relations? International life for the part of the world that has reached the end of history is far more preoccupied with economics than with politics or strategy. This does not by any means imply the end of international conflict per se. for the world at that point would be divided between a part that was historical and a part that was post-historical. Conflict between states still in history and between those states and those at the end of history would still be possible. There would still be a high and perhaps rising level of ethnic and nationalist violence, since those impulses are not completely played out. But large-scale conflict must involve large states still caught in the grip of history, and they are what appear to be passing from the scene. Fukuyama argues that the end of history will be a very sad time. The struggle for recognition, willingness to risk one's life for a purely abstract goal, the worldwide ideological struggle that calls for daring, courage, imagination, and idealism will be replaced by economic calculation, the endless solving of technical problems, environmental concerns, and the satisfaction of sophisticated consumer demands. Fukuyama concludes with a very interesting remark. I can feel in myself and see in others around me a powerful nostalgia for the time when history existed. Such nostalgia, in fact, will continue to fuel competition and conflict even in the post-historical world for some time to come. Even though I recognize its inevitability, I have the most ambivalent feelings for the civilization that has been created in Europe since 1945, with its North Atlantic and Asian offshoots. Perhaps this very prospect of centuries of boredom at the end of history will serve to get history started once again. That's it for today. Subscribe and support us on Patreon. Thank you very much and see you soon.